I mentally groaned and prepared to shadow walk myself back home, when Mr. Muir floored me. "Come on out, NightCaller. I know you're there." I was in utter shock. At the time, I was incorporeal, completely invisible to a normal human. I was also fairly sure that Mr. Muir was 100% human being. The fact that he was aware of me, when not in physical form, however, made me question if I'd been wrong about this. I wasn't looking forward to talking to this guy, because most people get really pissed off when they find out I'm trying to prove they are cheating on their spouses. I slipped out of the tree's shadow and walked over to him. I thought I at least should have the guts to face him. To my surprise, he didn't seem angry at all. "I trust this will put my wife at ease," he said matter-of-factly. "I believe it will serve until she freaks out again next week." I mentally berated myself for not having the good sense to end that sentence a little bit sooner. I was even more surprised when he burst into a hair-curling laugh that almost knocked me back with its force. "She's always terrified I'll go back to my old ways." "Old ways?" I responded. "I used to be a rather promiscuous, and she and my son never did really get along. We've been married a very long time. I thought she was over this fear." "I know," I groaned unhappily. "I really felt bad about letting you keep paying me for doing an investigation that will pull up nothing." "Don't worry about it. Money isn't an issue for us, and if it will settle her nerves, I'm fine with it." I was very relieved hearing him say that. I couldn't help but think that they had an awfully weird marriage, though. I wondered who his son might have been, but I didn't really think it was my business to ask. "Thanks for being understanding," I said, not really knowing what else to say. I considered just simply shadow walking home. I decided instead to take a detour over to the Fanged Smile. I was painfully thirsty. I can go quite a long while without blood, as can vampires in general. That being said, being thirsty sends my customer service straight to hell. I stepped back into the shadow of the tree near us and savored the feeling as I became incorporeal once more. I felt as if I disintegrated. For just a moment I was in every shadow. Then an instant later I felt myself come back together like condensing steam. I materialized again next to the Fanged Smile. The place was a blood bar for vampires. Alcohol was also on tap, but it had to be mixed with blood for a vampire's body to absorb it. I nodded in acknowledgement to the doorman, Bruce. Bruce was a handsome African man, about 7 feet in height. A 7-foot African man who was surrounded by at least 4 vampire girls, who seemed to want a bit more from him than admittance into the Fanged Smile. The Fanged Smile is one of my favorite places to grab a quick drink. As a result, I know Bruce rather well, despite his massive 7-foot frame. Bruce is a rather introverted musician. He bounces for the Fanged Smile for a little extra pocket money. He loves to play the piano, and I had the privilege on a few occasions of hearing him work the night as an entertainer. On this particular evening, I gave him a Cheshire grin and walked inside, leaving him to deal with his would-be harem. I exposed my fangs as I walked in, extending them to their full length and leaving them in plain sight. I did this because among vampires, it's something of a racial pride thing, to show our fangs among our own kind. The display was more important for me because I'm only half vampire. If I hid my fangs in a vampire club, it could be taken as being ashamed of my vampiric heritage, which is particularly offensive to full-blooded vampires. "Hey, Stephen," a voice called from the bar in a strong Jamaican accent. I recognized it immediately as the voice of Luis. Luis is a pure-blooded Jamaican. I don't know how old Luis is exactly, but I know he's got a couple centuries on me. He and I have been good friends for about the last 50 years. Luis smiled at me and beckoned me over to the bar. I was happy for his company, but quite eager for a drink. I could feel the unpleasant heat building up down my esophagus and in my chest. I knew from hard experience that it would quickly progress into an excruciating pain that felt as if I was on fire on the inside. The city's blood trade actually became big business once vampires and other blood-drinking creatures became common. A lot of people sold a pint here and there to make ends meet. I was full of the money from my last case, so I decided to splurge a little bit. I ordered a glass of blood from a 20-year-old concert violinist. One of the little-known secrets about vampire feeding is that we tend to retain some of the memories of the person we feed on. They're usually just hazy reflections. It's possible to make the memory stronger by repeatedly consuming blood from the same person. This particular young violinist, whose name I will not give by his own request, donates blood about once a month. I make a point of purchasing his blood because I want to absorb his memories of how to play the violin. I play the violin as well, but not nearly as well as he does. I took a mouthful of the blood and sighed in relief as it put out the fire within my chest. Luis sat there, leaning on an elbow and giving me a friendly smile. Luis wore his usual Armani suit with his ever-present tablet computer poking out from the inside pocket. He actually holds a PhD in botany and one in organic chemistry. I should note here that it is not illegal for the undead to use all manner of narcotics. This is because most of the chemical substances used by humans have no effect whatsoever on anyone with even the slightest trace of vampiric blood. This, unfortunately, also means we are immune to almost any form of medication. Luis, realizing this, has spent the last century devoting himself to creating drugs and other products for use of the fellow undead. For this reason, Luis is exceptionally wealthy. Upon his transformation, he chose to accept his new life as one of the undead and devote himself to improving the lifestyle of his fellow vampires. He created many recreational foodstuffs palatable to vampires. He is one of the few people I've met who were unbothered by their loss of humanity. Luis's creation of chocolate that can be eaten by vampires alone granted him a fortune and the gratitude of many of the oldest of our kind. It didn't take long for local chefs to invent a popular variation on the dessert, death by chocolate. They call it a ruby chocolate, and I would have to say it's one of Luis's better ideas. I continued to sip the blood of the concert violinist, and we had a pleasant enough conversation until an emaciated vampire broke a steel-framed bar stool on the back of my head. I crashed to the floor, ears ringing. As the skinny little man shouted, "Fucking bastard! I lost my wife and my car because of you!" This is why I hate adultery cases. I remembered that voice. I had caught this jerk skinny dipping with 2 nymphs and a mermaid about 4 months previous. I'm sure you can guess that his wife was not at all happy to find out about his little swim club. The next few seconds were a blur. Luis was off his bar stool instantly. He grabbed the other man, literally throwing him toward the door. "Bruce, get this piece of shit out of here," Luis snapped in his thick Jamaican accent. A second later, Luis lifted me like a sack of grain, pulling me off the floor and returning me to the bar stool next to him. "Occupational hazard," I blurted, as my very good friend ordered me another drink. It was then that I noticed the funny look Luis was giving me. "Occupational hazard?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "I am a PI, I reminded him. "Some husbands are really not happy to be caught cheating." "You could have fooled me. As often as I find you face down in the dirt, I thought you got your ass kicked for a living." "Could have been worse. I once caught a cheating wife who made a particularly enthusiastic attempt to castrate me for revenge." Luis laughed uproariously at this and put Bob Marley's Freebird on the jukebox. This was Luis's habit when he really felt like partying. The rest of the night was a blur of blood alcohol and crazy stories. I woke up the next morning, lying on the couch in my office, with a note from Luis sitting on my chest. It's indeed fortunate that my office window is made of UV glass, which prevented me from receiving a truly severe wake-up call. The note said, "Man, I never knew you were such a lightweight." I mentally groaned. About 5 or 6 of the vampires I knew had been in that room last night. I don't need to be a detective to know that I just left myself a very embarrassing legacy. I looked over at my alarm clock and realized it was about 5:50 p.m. I'm sure you can already guess that having vampiric blood means I start working at sunset. I also noticed from the taste in my mouth, I drink quite a lot of my favorite whiskey with that blood the night before. This left me with a truly impressive hangover, which is why I was so annoyed when someone's fist began rapping on my door 10 minutes before my open hours. I dragged myself off the couch, which hurt terribly. When vampires sleep, they become corpses for the duration. A full-blooded vampire has no sense of pain except for their fangs and their heart, meaning that they do not feel the rigor mortis that results from their temporary transformation into a dead body. I, on the other hand, unfortunately still have my sense of pain being partially human. The process of being reanimated is quite unpleasant, but is less severe if I do not attempt to move until the process is complete. I wasn't able to do so on this particular evening as the incessant pounding on my door affected my hangover as if it were a battering ram inside my skull trying to beat its way out. Out of the 2 pains I was in, I chose that the headache was slightly worse than the horrible body aches of being reanimated. I dragged myself off the couch barefoot and shirtless and swung my door open, ready to give the party on the other side an unbelievably large piece of my mind. I found myself staring at the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. After my brain managed to beat my hormones back into submission, I pointed and said the modeling agency is down the hall. The woman giggled, which developed into a full-blown laugh a moment later. I stood there indignant until she reached into her purse and extracted a GEB identification card. Her name was Arohi Agate, and she was a GEB field agent. The GEB, or Gate Enforcement Bureau, is a special police force whose responsibility is to keep peace between humans and non-humans. The Bureau came into existence as part of the peace accords that allowed the necropolis to be founded. The necropolis is also called the Undead Quarters by locals. It gets its name because most of the undead citizens of Umbra City live in this area.